Hi there, my name's Dr. Sam Wetherell, and I am a lecturer in the history of Britain and the world at the University of York, where I've worked for the last couple of years. I'm going to talk for just a few minutes about Black history at York and about the course that I teach. But first, I want to set what I'm saying within a bit of a broader context. Recently, the Royal Historical Society, the kind of big national body that governs all historians across the country, produced a really worrying report about the extremely white nature of British and actually history more generally as it's taught and practiced and studied in Britain. It found that 96.1% of all history lecturers across the country were white, and that Black historians in particular make up just less than 1% of British of historians working in Britain. I kind of want to begin actually before talking about the good news and talking about the way things are changing by saying that we are still in a really bad situation in terms of representation in history. Needless to say, it shouldn't be someone who looks like me giving this talk, perhaps, might be another way of putting this. And certainly for a long period of time, British history has been effectively understood as a domestic story about white people. When I did my A-levels in 2004, 2003, 2004, many years ago now, the history that I learned was entirely the domestic history of high British politics. I learned about basically white elite politicians, people like Gladstone, people like Disraeli, prime ministers, kings, queens, and even when I went to university, I remember learning almost nothing or being exposed to almost nothing about the history of Britain's empire or about the history of non-white people living in Britain. I particularly remember taking a history course about 18th century British history at university. This was at Oxford University in 2007. In which there were 8 weeks of reading. We learnt about George III, we learnt about the Whig oligarchy, we learnt about politeness, we learned about the French Revolution, a handful of other things I don't remember. But what we didn't learn about were all of the important things going on in 18th century Britain. We didn't learn about the slave trade, for example. We didn't learn about the extensive colonization of India. We didn't learn about the settlements of Australia and the genocide perpetrated against Australian native people. This all changed for me when I actually moved to the United States and did a PhD in British history there, and became extremely interested in imperial and Black British history and issues of decolonization in the 20th century. Certainly was exposed to a whole new set of voices and stories and things that I'd never learned about before. And I think the good news is that British history is changing. It's going through an extraordinary moment of reckoning. We're beginning to think about the ways that we can decolonize, not just the way that history is taught, but British public spaces. We should be questioning the existence of statues commemorating slave owners. We should be rethinking the names of buildings that are named after slave owners. We should be questioning the very basis of where the British state got its money from, of the way that British development was completely implicated in the history of empire and the exploitation of non-white people. And all of these pose very radical and I think really exciting and politically urgent questions about the British state and about British history. So the course that I teach at York is for first years. It's called Between the Empire and Me, Race and Decolonization in 20th Century Britain. And the course is basically an introduction to Black British history for first-year undergraduates arriving at York. Many of the students that arrive were people like myself that have never studied Black British history before A-level, and that equate Black history with the American story of civil rights and Martin Luther King. And are much more familiar with that story than with Britain's own civil rights movement. In the course, I touch on themes such as decolonization, so talking about the extremely sort of violent and chaotic end of Britain's empire. I prioritize a lot of Black voices and Black activists within Britain's empire and at home. People like Stuart Hall, who's a huge influence on my own intellectual life. People like Darcus Howe, and look at the ways that Black people formed particular kinds of communities in Britain, political communities, communities of culture in the 1960s and 1970s. I'm interested in periods of unrest in the 1980s. I talk about racism, about the white response to British immigration, whether that's Enoch Powell or more contemporary right-wing politics. If you Google my name, Sam Wetherell, Wetherell, and the course name Between the Empire and Me, you can find out a little bit more about the course. And certainly if you're interested in applying to York, or if you're interested in learning more about the course, please feel free to email me. I'll do my best to respond. I hope that, as I said, we're at quite an early stage of a big radical project of rethinking Britain's history, we need as many people doing that work as possible. So if this is something that interests you, then wherever you end up studying, or really whatever you end up doing, I hope it's something that you'll